China may surpass the U.S. as the world's largest economy this year, this according to a recent report by the World Bank. Other reports have been predicting this shift for years, but it was expected to happen closer to 2020. Some officials now question the method used in the latest report, and others have suggested that China is shying away from the responsibility that comes from a new global standing. We're going to get into this right now. Anil Gupta, professor of strategy and globalization and entrepreneurship from the University of Maryland, joins me. Good to see you again.
Good to see you again, Phil.
You know, China normally, if something good happens and you win an award, you usually say, hey, I won an award.
Right.
But in this case, it's different. China is disputing the fact that the World Bank reports say that they're not number one. Explain this.
I think, it's a challenge to be number one because clearly what it means is that you have some rights, but you also have some responsibilities. And I think it's a delicate balance, and I think China is trying to figure out how does it behave like, the world's biggest economy? I mean, even China doesn't dispute that it's the second largest economy in the world. I don't think China disputes or would dispute that there is a purchasing power parity difference between the average Chinese and the average.
Because one of the experts I was listening to on Chinese media was talking about the purchasing power parity, and they're saying it's unfair because the U.S. has a different group of goods that you and I buy.
Sure.
And in China, they have a different set of goods, and it's unfair to say that the two sets of goods are exactly the same. And look, there might be some small differences, but car, home, I mean, all these things are going to be similar, aren't they?
Exactly, that's right. But there are differences. I mean, for example, let's say a haircut. Is a haircut a haircut? And so, and what about the quality of the haircut that you might get, let's say, in a tier 3 town in China versus what you might get in Washington, D.C. But that said, the main thing I would say is that even at market exchange rates, China's GDP is more than 50% of U.S.
Why does it matter who's number one? I mean, it's a big bragging right. I get that, but why should the rest of the world care who's number one? What does it really mean?
I think, what really matters at the end of the day is what your per capita income is and how well off your people are. That's really what matters.
That's a tougher calculation.
That's a tougher calculation. However, having said that it's per capita income that's really important, it does matter who is number one in terms of number one bragging rights, but actually more than bragging rights. That in the global league, or whether it's trade relationships, investment relationships, various other bilateral or multilateral organizations, it's nations that have a seat at the table.
You're a professor, so you're going to teach all of us. Help us explain this GDP. We talk about GDP almost every single day.
Right.
How do they exactly calculate GDP? What's the best way to explain that?
Actually, I mean, GDP is calculated, in more than one way. But, for example, one way to think about GDP really is how much was produced in the country.
In the country.
In the country. And so, for example, let's say if China imports $1.8 trillion worth of goods and it exports $2 trillion worth of goods, then actually it's the net exports, which is $200 billion. Plus, of course, all the things that were consumed within China.
So if I spend $5 on plastics and then I build an iPhone and I sell it for $7, I make that $2, and that $2 multiplied by everything becomes your gross domestic product, right?
Exactly. That $2 goes into your gross domestic product. Of course, whatever people produce and consume that's not exported becomes your gross domestic product. On the other hand, it's not just what you consume. So, for example, let's say you build a highway, you build a railroad. That's not really consumption in this one year. But at the same time, it's an investment in terms of the stock of wealth of the country. And so therefore so really GDP, one way in which it is accounted for is the investment, it is the consumption, and it is the net exports.
But there's something I still don't understand is why would China not want to be number one, whether it's too early or too late? I mean, it's pretty cool to be number one, as you just said. I mean, there are benefits of being number one. Is it possible there's a currency issue? There's possible other implications that we haven't thought about yet?
I think it's a currency issue, but it's also, because essentially what happens when you are number one, and you are, if China were, if we say China is number one by PPP, what that means is that China is about 15% of the world's GDP and not about 11%. And actually pretty soon it will be, say, 20% in a few years. And what that means is that when you are that big a chunk of the world, then you cannot just think about yourself. You have to think about the world. And so and you simply cannot avoid it. China knows. I mean, I cannot imagine, given the smart leadership China has, that they don't know that. So I think really it's a case of can you postpone it by a year, by 2 years? It's not a whole lot longer that even Chinese leadership or Chinese media would not accept very openly that China is the world's #1 economy by PPP.
Final thought in terms of challenges facing China. Whether or not they're #1 or #2.
That's right.
There are some real challenges.
Oh,
here.
yes.
What's going to be the biggest issue now going into the next year or two? What are they focused on?
I think the biggest issue really would be two. One is the slowdown in the economy, and there's nothing China can do to avoid the slowdown. So it's really a question of how sharp, how much of a slowdown. That's #1. Many people might say within China is that an even bigger issue is the environment.
Two very, very big topics. We're going to have you back again to discuss that for us.
Good to see you
Professor Gupta, good to see you from the University of Maryland.